And so if even the right is sympathetic to the idea, oh, there must be an imperfection in capitalism because it leads to inequality, and you wonder why socialism always returns, well, maybe it's because the very ideas that the socialists depend upon are ones that are shared even by the right.
These people don't understand what is socialism's strongest weapon, what is socialism's nuclear weapon. And this is socialism's moral appeal. A moral appeal that even its enemies cannot refute. Every few years, a new figure preaching socialism rises in American politics. And each time, conservatives and centrists are left asking themselves the same question. Why won't socialism die? And the latest example is Zohran Mamdani, the 33-year-old socialist who is now the front runner to become mayor of New York City. But what if the way the enemies of socialism diagnose the problem, and what if the solutions they offer actually contribute to socialism's numerous resurrections? What if socialism comes back time and again because we never properly understand it, and therefore we can never properly fight it? That's the question that we will explore today on the Ayn Rand Institute podcast. Together with my colleague, Ben, we will look at a recent Wall Street Journal article where 9 editors tried to make sense of Mamdani's rise. We will examine their explanations for socialism's endurance, and we will put on the test the remedies they propose. So Ben, why do we think that this article is important to comment on?
First and foremost, socialism really is an evil doctrine, both in theory and in practice. In practice, it's slaughtered millions of people because of the vicious theory that individuals are unreal and insignificant, except in relation to some alleged greater collective. And the second reason we should talk about this and comment on this article is because if you don't understand where this vicious doctrine comes from, I think you're doomed to repeat it. And even that's true, even if you repeat it using different flags, different slogans, different colors than red. And we're talking about this in a week where President Trump just announced American government ownership stakes in Intel and his desire to acquire even more stakes in private companies, keeping in mind, of course, that state ownership of the means of production is a key aspect of socialism. So what do the alleged critics of socialism have to say about where it comes from, why it's wrong? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that appears in the Wall Street Journal that you might argue with or comment on, but this one, I think, was especially worthy of comment because first, it was 9 short essays by each of the major members of the Wall Street Journal editorial board. So we're talking about some important thought leaders on the right in America, the ones who, if anyone is seen as offering an antidote, offering a solution response to socialism, you surely would think it's the editors of the Wall Street Journal. And so, well, how well equipped are they to do it? We got a good picture of this from this article, where they give what I think are a wide representative array of typical explanations given for the return or the rise of socialism on the right, but they're typical in that they're highly conventional. They're I think, not very deep, not very thoughtful, and if this is the best that the editors of the Wall Street Journal have to offer regarding their understanding of the socialist threat, we're in for some trouble.
Okay, so let us jump in the first theme that the editors come up with on socialism endurance. And this is that socialism is an impulse, that socialism is something that will be with us forever, that has been with us forever. So, Ben, how do you make sense of it? Because it's not very clear to me what they mean here.
Yeah, it's not clear to me either. And I should mention that the big 5 explanations that we're going to look at today, I think we're going to cover them in increasing order of plausibility, which means we're starting with the least plausible, I think the silliest explanations. And this falls into that category. And you see this in Alicia Finley's idea, her comparison that socialism is like a plague that never dies. Well, that's an interesting metaphor, but Is it true that it never dies? Is it true that it's just like a force of nature? Barton Swaim says that he calls it a socialist impulse. Like the poor it's meant to aid will always be with us. Well, why is that? Why do they think that it's just this ongoing force that like a zombie always rises from the grave? I mean, it expresses a kind of almost mystical, Manichaean idea of evil, that it's just this disembodied, malevolent force that has a will of its own. And the thing is that it's not. Socialism is a human idea. It's an idea devised by human beings originally, and which continues to be chosen by human beings. Or at least it has continued to be chosen, but it's not that it had to be chosen. It's a choice. And so the question is, why do people make the choice when they make it, given that they don't have to? And what motivates them to do it? What enables their ability to do it? It is not a malevolent supernatural force. It's a human choice, which they could choose otherwise. And we need to understand the basis of that choice, the motivation of that choice.
Yeah, and maybe what they imply there is that we have this tendency to cooperate with others, and socialism somehow means working together with others. But obviously, there are two mistakes there. Number one, it is so flattering for socialism to equate it with cooperation. Actually, it's the opposite. Cooperation implies that I have the freedom to choose who I cooperate with. Cooperation under a whip is not cooperation. And the second, even cooperation and coming together with other people and working together, this is still an achievement. This is not something which is an impulse. So again, saying that socialism, there's something that we are wired for socialism, it's already giving socialism way too much credit, and it is not a way to fight socialism. Because people will say, if socialism is our nature, then all we have to do is listen to nature's calling and become socialist. And actually, I've heard this many times during my time as a socialist. So this first explanation, I think, should be dismissed very quickly. It doesn't say much.
No human outlook, philosophy, policy, practice is a wired-in impulse. It's a product of deliberate choice.
That's absolutely true. Now, let us move to a second theme in the article, which says that what can explain socialism is ignorance. That young people turn to socialism because they are not educated enough. Either they're not educated about history, so they don't know the crimes of socialism, the crimes of communism, they don't know about the gulags, the killing fields, or they're not properly educated in sound economics. Therefore, they believe that if the state tells you, I'm going to give a higher salary to everyone, just like that, everyone will be richer. Now, the argument that socialism thrives on ignorance, first of all, there's a first level objection that some of the most prominent advocates of socialism are people who were really who are at the most educated strata. Socialism is more popular among the educated middle classes, and it's more popular among PhD students and university professors. And actually, Ben, you and I, we spent a lot of our adult lives in such intellectual circles, and I don't think that socialism's popularity is the result of any ignorance. Actually, most of the socialists I knew, they were aware of the crimes. I mean, I was aware of the crimes of socialism. But there were two ways of rationalizing this bad record of socialism. The number one way to rationalize it is to saying that, well, these numbers are exaggerated, or this is imperialistic propaganda. But there's a second way, which is more delicate. And this is that, yes, we will accept that indeed in the past socialism has brought piles of corpses and it has failed as an experiment. But it was all for a good cause. It was all done under the best of motives. And therefore, it is worth trying again. And this time we will do it better. And notice the premise there. The premise is that socialism is something which is worth going towards. It's something which is moral. And therefore, if we're after something which is moral, we should try it as many times as possible. And there's a third element there, a third trump card that socialists will throw on the table every time we talk about past mistakes. They will say these examples, East Germany, Soviet Union, Cuba, these were not real socialism. And we've done a whole episode, Ben, debunking that myth that so that this was not real socialism. But the takeaway here for me is this. If facts alone could kill socialism, socialism would have died long ago. Even if we would, we would get a huge donation by someone and we could project this video about the crimes of socialism to billions of people and it will play all day on TV, I think still socialism would not die. There's actually more intellectual heavy lifting to be done than just pointing to past failures of socialism and saying it's only the uneducated who buy into socialism. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I agree with that. And the one thing I would say, the reason I think this is not the most implausible explanation, I think there is an element of truth to it in that I think some amount of ignorance can explain at least why very, very young people are attracted to an idea like this, where it's not just that they don't know the history, they don't even know what they're doing with their minds when they're playing around with philosophical ideas. But the fact that some number of young people might find it appealing because of their ignorance doesn't do very much to explain the popularity of socialism. Because for one thing, I mean, the youngest people don't vote. For another thing, of course, the people who are educating the young people are older people who are better educated people. You, of course, mentioned that this is an idea that's been alive in academia for a long time, and these are very educated people. And several of the essays in the Wall Street Journal mention this fact. They say that it's been around for such a long time in academia. So it can't be lack of education, whether about history or about economics. And one of the most prominent advocates of socialism today is Richard Wolff, who's an emeritus professor of economics at UMass Amherst. And so he's certainly not uneducated. And he's one of the ones who's best known for arguing that real socialism hasn't been tried. When you talk about the Soviet Union, he says, oh, no, that wasn't socialism. It was state capitalism, which is a whole other rationalization we could spend time talking about. But you need to actually know a lot about different economic theories and different ideologies and histories, even to gin up that rationalization. And it's a whole separate conversation to explain what's wrong with it. So this is, when I said before, the question is, this is a human choice to believe and to try to practice socialism. What actually empowers it? This is an example of that it takes human intelligence even to concoct fanciful explanations, fanciful attempts to explain away the facts. It even takes a lot of knowledge. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing, as they say. But one more thing I'll say is that a respect in which this explanation is not completely detached from reality, related again to the young, to the extent that very young people are interested in socialism. Part of it is also because they are not educated about the alternative, about the nature of capitalism. That's something I'll come back to more later.
Yes. And related to this issue of knowledge and experience is another argument we see in the article, which says that it's because these people have not experienced socialism. But once they see socialism in action in New York, and once their martini drinks and their soy latte coffees become more expensive, then these people will learn the hard way. Now, here's why I'm not convinced with that. Even people who lived under the most brutal regimes, sometimes they don't get the right lesson. So experience by itself does not guarantee that you will take the right lessons. An example, some years after the fall of the wall in East Germany, there was an opinion poll in former residents of East Germany, of DDR. And it asked them to evaluate the idea that socialism was good in theory, but it failed in practice. And 83% of them agreed that, yes, indeed, socialism is a good idea. So even people who experienced the Stasi, who experienced the wall, they still couldn't draw the conclusion that the problem is not with Honecker or whoever was running East Germany. The problem is actually with socialism. So this means that we cannot expect that socialism should come and fail for socialism to be delegitimized. Not to mention that this treats everyone in New York who is not a socialist and who will suffer the bad consequences of socialism, it treats them as guinea pigs. So no, we shouldn't first suffer from socialism and then we will understand why it's bad.
Yeah, your point, I think, is especially true if you keep in mind the fact that part of the reason people won't learn from suffering the bad consequences is, as you hinted at earlier, part of what drives a belief in socialism is a certain moral idea. And that moral idea usually includes the idea there's a virtue in suffering. Like that if it might mean a lot of pain for us in the short term, but eventually communism or socialism will triumph. I mean, that's the history of life under 70 years of socialism in the Soviet Union, of series of different 5-year plans, where each time it was said the people will have to sacrifice for 5 years, but after this we'll have a glorious future. And so that idea that there's a virtue in suffering because there's a virtue in self-sacrifice for the greater good, that is, in fact, one of the intellectual rationalizations, the moral idea that you had in mind, that has aided and abetted every single socialist scheme over the years. And so, of course, you won't learn from experience if your intellectual philosophical rationalization allows you to reconceptualize that experience in a way that saves your theory from refutation. We'll come back to the idea that it's good in theory but bad in practice, but part of what allows them to think that it's good in theory is that you're able to reconceptualize experience in a way that saves the theory from refutation. One more thing I would add here is that this idea that there's a virtue in self-sacrifice, and the idea that you should believe the leaders who say that the sacrifice will pay off for something in the end, the idea that you should have faith in your leaders, both of these ideas, self-sacrifice and faith, are ideas that are themselves abetted by the very long-standing influence of an ideology that goes back much longer than Karl Marx. It's a religious ideology. It's an ideology that comes from Christianity that's had enormous influence on the West. It's why socialism arose in the West in the first place. It didn't arise in China or India or anything like that. And so when you're talking about what is it that allows this zombie to come back to life, it's the continuing endurance of that idea, which, yes, it's very old, but it's not something that's been with us since the dawn of humanity. It's been with us for about 2,000 years. And unless
200 years.
2,000 years for Christianity.
Well, yeah.
And unless and until the editors of the Wall Street Journal are willing to grapple with that, it's going to keep coming back.
True. But let us move now, Ben, to a different category of arguments. So another argument is that Mamdani and socialism are appealing because they target the immaturity and the naive idealism of the youth. Socialism, in other words, is just a phase. You go through it, then you take it out of your system, and then you grow up and you experience real life, you get a job, and then you reject socialism. And actually, I think, Ben, this is one of the worst arguments. So I would put it higher in the list. Because this take completely misses what is actually the strongest appeal of socialism. It is its false idealism and its false notion of moral superiority. Actually, no, I would say the idealism is real. Many socialists are true believers, but they're true believers in horrible ideals. So what this suggests that, these are just naive young people, let them grow and then they'll forget it. We just wait hoping that everyone will sooner rather than later become a cynic and no one will anymore take ideas seriously. But it is actually the idealistic people who take ideas seriously and who inspire others. These are the people who change history. These are the people who take a culture by the hand and lead it to new directions. So actually we need idealism and we need these moralistic visionaries, to put it this way. But they need to have good ideals and a good moral vision. We cannot just hope that, people will have enough with ideas. And then what? How are we going to live? Under which principles are we going to operate? So we will always be guided by some principles. The question is, which principles are these and how do we choose them and how do we argue for them?
Yeah, there's a lot that gets packed into the allegation that socialism is some kind of youthful expression of youthful naivete. Several of these articles by the editors of the Wall Street Journal said, well, it's that the young people want instant gratification, they want simplicity. I think there's a lot of ways in which the ideas we've been talking about are not that simple. All the rationalizations of the socialist crimes of the past, as we've already discussed, and Marxist economics involve all kinds of intellectual complexity. But to get to the deeper point, the idea that it's a phase for idealistic young people. You're right that, what's true here is that young people do tend to be more idealistic. And this is a good thing about them. It's a good thing that they want to live up to the ideals that they believe in and that they're taught. That is a sign of integrity, that you want to practice what you preach. And if you know that the reason we need preaching is because we need guidance in life and we want to live a better life, then the cynicism of this response, as you say, is a rather dark kind of thing. It's bad to encourage cynicism and it's bad to discourage idealism. And so, as you suggest, if there's a problem here, it's not with idealism as such. It's with the particular ideals that they are, for one reason or another, led into taking seriously. And we've already commented on how, the problem here may be the fact that the ideals in question are these ancient religious ideals that young people are taking more seriously than the elders who teach them these ideals. They're thinking about, well, what does it actually mean to practice the idea that you should love your brother, which is an idea that comes from religion. And in this case, the adults are rather uncomfortable with the implication that ideal actually has. But Nikos, we should talk more about where does this idea that there's something impractical about ideals come from, the idea that it works in theory but not in practice, and that's why it's thought that young people are naive.
Well, that's at the end of the day the strongest appeal of socialism. And also notice that this is an argument that many conservatives make, that socialism is good in theory but doesn't work in practice. And I never understood this, Ben. I always thought this is a huge own goal if you make this claim, because if something is good in theory, then we should try as hard as possible to try it time and again till it finally works in practice. Therefore, that's what the socialists say. They say our theory is solid, our theory explains the world as it should be, explains the world in the state that it would be a perfect world, and we're just trying to make it happen. And yes, we fail, but then we try again, and at some point we will achieve it. And I don't know, Ben, did you notice that most liked comment below actually the article, which is someone who says that, socialism is good in theory, but it does not take into accordance that human beings are greedy, that human beings will always want more, will always want more free stuff, and therefore this is why socialism does not work. Now, let's break down what this means. This means that socialism is too good for us, that socialism is a brilliant idea, but we human beings, we are fallen. We are morally corrupt. We are not good enough for socialism. And this is an argument that comes supposedly from enemies of socialism. How does this make sense? How do you fight socialism by saying it's this brilliant ideal, but we're not good enough for this? So this is an argument that I would expect to hear from some socialists claiming that, you people are not good enough for our system. But I'm so surprised to see it coming from supposed enemies of socialism. How do you fight socialism? By giving them the moral high ground. This is the strongest tool they have. The claim that ours is the good system, we have the right by our side. And you're handing it to them on a silver platter.
Yeah, I saw that comment, and one of the interesting things about it, I mean, let me read the comment because it's revealing. The commenter says, the central idea of socialism is to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. That's about right. The problem with this idea is human nature being what it is. The great majority of people have a long list of what they, quote, need and are more than willing to let the next guy hand the supply to said needs. And so the quote there from Marx about from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, which I think is from the German ideology, right, Nikos? It's that's the idea from Marx that is truly at the core of socialist ideology, but which also brings out most clearly why the core moral idea of socialism is something that comes from Christianity. I mean, it's so close to things that you hear in the Sermon on the Mount. It's so close to, Christ's idea that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into heaven. That if you want to truly be holy, what you need is to sell everything you have and come and follow him. That the poor are always with us. That is another line from Christ. That who is my neighbor? The answer to the question that he gives is the story of the Good Samaritan, which is that the person we don't know, the person we don't care about, that's the one who's our neighbor, the one that we need to give up for. So much of this is empowered by religion. And that's part of the reason, I think, then why people have this view that what works in theory doesn't work in practice. Because what they mean when they say that it works in theory is simply, well, when I hear this noble sounding moral ideal, it resonates with the idea of nobility that I got from my preachers in church when I was little. And that's all that it means, because it's not that they can work out some kind of theoretical explanation or justification deducing from some other first principles why it works in theory. So there's no other reason or meaning for why it works in theory. But then precisely because there is no actual rational reason why it works in theory, why that doctrine of religious faith is no rational justification at all. It's because it doesn't work in theory that it doesn't work in practice. And one manifestation of this is the reason it doesn't work in practice is not that everybody's actually selfish and wants to grab what they can, because that's not true. Because some people are manifestly not selfish. Some people are Mother Teresa types, including many who advocate for socialism and are willing to sacrifice for the sake of the next 5-year plan. So it's simply not true that everybody's selfish. What's true, what doesn't work in practice, is the ideal of self-sacrifice that is advocated by religion. Nobody can live consistently according to that ideal. Nobody can try giving up and giving up and giving up for the sake of no return and expect to be able to live. Every bite of food that they take will always be a source of guilt because they know they could give it to somebody else. And you see this through the history of attempts at socialism. When those who are selfless do sacrifice and give up for the sake of others, what ends up happening is the others who they're giving up to, they're supposed to give up for the sake of the needy, for the sake of those who don't have ability, who haven't chosen to develop ability, who haven't succeeded. When you give up for the sake of them, what you're doing is you're leading to nothing but the consumption of capital and stock seed, and you destroy all stores of value for the future. You don't invest in production. You don't reward the productive. Therefore, as a result, society ends up increasingly living hand to mouth, and therefore begins to collapse to lower and lower rungs of poverty and destruction. And this is, of course, the ultimate reason why socialism has a history of famine and starvation, because those who are productive, because of their moral ideal, end up giving up, end up not rewarding themselves. So they are being selfless, but then that leads to the destruction of the actually productive. It leads to this destruction of value, and the race then goes to the more brutal.
And here's a fun fact related to what you said, that many socialists actually take sacrifice seriously. They're truly selfless. Do you know what was the number one cause of death for the prominent Bolsheviks before the number one cause of death became Stalin and his purges? The number one cause of ill health was overwork. These people were destroying themselves trying to build socialism. They were working 20 hours every day. The doctors could try to keep them away from their offices, but they said, no, I want so much to build the socialism. Many indeed lived in very poor accommodation. So they were true believers. And exactly because they were true believers, they brought these horrors. There's a direct correlation between how close to the letter of socialism its advocates stick and the piles of corpses they leave behind. And one more plug here. If someone wants to see how this, from each according to ability to each according to need, how it would work in practice, there's this brilliant passage in Atlas Shrugged, the story of the 20th century motor company factory. I encourage people to read Atlas Shrugged, or if they have read it some time ago, to reread this part where this ideal is trying to be put into practice, and then you see how it plays out and how the disaster relates very closely to following this idea faithfully. Now let's move though, Ben, to one other explanation, which is more convincing the truth is. And this explanation says that there are real problems out there, and more people get impatient with the current state of the economy and of the cultural and social problems. And it is true that the current system, the current mixed economy, which we should say leans more and more towards the one side of the mixed system, which is statism, this system leaves a lot to be desired. And actually, I'm not surprised that many people get inspired by the prospects of something new and by the prospects of something which is out of the box. The problem is, though, that the out-of-the-box offer is worse than what's in the box. Mamdani and what he offers will actually make all these problems, the cost of living, the lack of dynamism, the lack of innovation, the lack of the sense of people not feeling secure. He will make these things actually worse. And here's a question. When it comes to these legitimate grievances of people who struggle to make ends meet or who want a more dynamic economy, the question is, in our mixed economy, which elements are mostly to blame for the dysfunctioning areas of the economy? Is it the statist elements? Is it the state control, the regulations? Or is it the free market elements? Another way to test this. Do we find more malfunctions in the heavily regulated and controlled fields, such as housing and healthcare, or in the less regulated fields, like Silicon Valley, or in, the fields of culture and entertainment? So, Ben, I think it makes sense for people to be dissatisfied. It makes sense that they don't want to see the same faces again and again, the people who haven't achieved anything in politics. But the solution is not to bring in someone like Mamdani, no?
Yes, and part of the reason I think this is one of the more plausible explanations, though still not quite getting it right, is because for sure there are massive economic problems that we're dealing with that cause inflation and unemployment, and people are certainly reacting to that. But here's where I think the point about education is more applicable. It's not that people are uneducated about the history of socialism. It's that they're uneducated about the history and nature of capitalism. The flaw in the reasoning of the Wall Street Journal article, the editors, really comes out, especially in the comment from Gerard Baker, who says, socialism's fortunes tend to improve when capitalism's imperfections result in widening inequalities. Culturally brainwashed and financially disenchanted young graduates adopt it when they find that their expensive educations haven't been the ticket to self-advancement that they had hoped for. Well, the issue here is that people don't know what capitalism is. And it's not just the people who are voting for Mamdani. It's apparently the editors of the Wall Street Journal who say that the dislocations and stagnation that we experience economically in our current system is because of imperfections in capitalism. But as you suggest, Nikos, there are so many ways in which the economic problems we experience today are not a result of capitalism, but a result of the mixed economy, a result of various statist forms of intervention. And the only reason you would think that they're a result of capitalism is if you have an extremely superficial understanding of what capitalism is. You think that capitalism is a system in which there are private businesses, or in which bankers get to do things, which is as superficial a level definition of capitalism as you can offer. Capitalism is a social system in which all property is privately owned, in which government is dedicated to the protection of individual rights. And that is a system that is fully inconsistent and incompatible with statist economic intervention, even when it is on behalf of, or allegedly for the sake of, so-called business interests. And so this is you see this in many of the kinds of explanations or the anecdotes that came up in some of these articles. So, for example, they talked about, when there was the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, you got the rise of the Occupy Wall Street movement, the assumption being, the Occupy Wall Street movement, they were protesting the bankers who caused the financial crisis. But that's the mistake of the Occupy movement, to think that it was capitalism that was to blame for the financial crisis. It's easy to illustrate and easy to provide evidence for the fact that the housing bubble that we saw in the late first decade of the 20th century was the result of all kinds of statist interventions in the market, including all kinds of mandatory policies whereby people had to give up more loans to people who couldn't afford to give them back. Many of these were initiated by the Clinton administration, not to mention the much broader macroeconomic factor, which was the manipulation of interest rates, the artificially low interest rates that made it easier to borrow, that inflated this bubble, which then, of course, inevitably had to crash, as all artificially induced bubbles will always do. Interesting question about what we're going to have with that coming up soon. And if people are voting for socialism now because of the economic problems that we're experiencing, I mean, you can tell exactly the same story. We had historically low, if not negative, interest rates for the last few years in attempts to deal with COVID, which obviously jacked up inflation. We've talked about this in some recent episodes. It's not just Biden, it's not just Trump, it's both of them and their cooperation with the whole Federal Reserve System. And this is not a protection of business interests. It's oftentimes destroying business interests, though sometimes business people will get involved in government and become part of the problem. But to that extent, they are becoming statists themselves. And I think we see that especially with the current Trump administration, that will be suffering, I think, more consequences from that shortly. But one last thing about this, Nikos, is that in that same passage that I read from Gerard Baker, you see another example of the kind of problem that we've been talking about, of the alleged defenders of capitalism actually endorsing ideas that lead to more of the socialism that we are now complaining about. So Baker said that socialism's fortunes tend to improve when capitalism's imperfection result in widening inequalities. Well, we've already commented on what's wrong with thinking of this as about capitalism's imperfections. But here's the additional point, that he's just assuming that widening inequalities are necessarily bad. The idea, this is the egalitarian idea, that there's necessarily something unjust when some people earn more success than others, even though it can sometimes be because of the fact that they are actually harder working, more virtuous producers, more intelligent, etc., where they deserve to earn the profits that they earn. And the idea that they don't, the idea that there's necessarily something wrong with that kind of economic inequality, well, that is the exact same kind of egalitarian moral thinking that encourages the socialists. And so if even the right, even someone like Gerard Baker working for the Wall Street Journal, is sympathetic to the idea, there must be an imperfection in capitalism because it leads to inequality, and you wonder why socialism always returns, well, maybe it's because the very ideas that the socialists depend upon are ones that are shared even by the right. And that's, of course, because of the fact the right is getting it from their Christian religion. So is it any surprise that young people who are taught these ideas by their sometimes even right-wing elders then try to look at the system and say, what's the way that we can actually practice these ideas politically and economically? And the answer, of course, is tear down the successful in favor of those who lack success, who lack ability. That's what socialism does.
When I was reading these points, the mental image I had is these guys are throwing their shields and are leaving the battle. But listening to what you said, they're doing actually something even worse. They're not even throwing their shields and their weapons. They're turning their weapons against the side they are supposed to defend. So capitalism with socialism with enemies like these people doesn't need any supporters and any friends. But let's go to the final now point, or the final explanation for the rise of socialism, which is that explanation number 5. Woke ideology is the thing to explain the return of socialism. So we've been overwhelmed. Our education system, the woke ideology has set a foothold in education, on culture, and this is why now we get these socialist politicians, because the people who got indoctrinated in these ideas, now they are the voters and now they are the active politicians. So you train you train socialists, what are you going to get? Socialists. And there is a level, obviously, of, that's at the end of the day, something like this is happening. But this is also a cyclical argument, because it doesn't answer the question, why did the woke ideology find fertile ground in the first place? Why did woke succeed even in the business world? And it didn't bulldoze itself carrying guns. Most businesses and most institutions accepted it voluntarily. And that's because the intellectual gates were open. And no one could pose any strong defense against the woke ideology. And let me give one simple example. DEI, diversity programs. Everyone now is standing up. Oh, DEI is horrible. But what is actually the essence, the creed of DEI? The creed of DEI is you need to sacrifice your selfish desire to fully control your business. And you shouldn't run your business only for profit. You should also accept that you have a social duty to serve, that you need to give back. And how do you give back? By giving chances, giving opportunities to the less fortunate. And you run your business to the benefit of the wider society. And one question then, how many conservatives who are ready to go against this premise, against this idea that you shouldn't run your business only for yourself? How many could stand up and say, no, you should run your business only for your own interest and for your own profit, because it is your business. This is what this is what freedom means. Of course, they cannot say this, and this is why, at the end of the day, woke won, because it played in a field without an opponent.
Yeah, you're right. There are very few people on the right, very few conservatives who are willing to challenge the idea that you just mentioned. And I've commented in the past that I think even the term woke is a really kind of evasive, it represents an evasive unwillingness to face what these ideologies that are called woke actually have in common with each other. And what they have in common with each other is egalitarianism, the same idea that I mentioned Gerard Baker as basically having endorsed. As true, there's a particularly modern new version of egalitarianism where it's applied to questions about race and sex that is somewhat novel compared to traditional Marxism. It's novel with regard to various identity classes, intersectional or otherwise. But it's still the same old idea. It's the idea that whatever the class or group that we identify, the one that has the power, the one that's on top, that's the one that must therefore have gotten it unjustly, which is just another version of the old Marxist idea, the old Marxist egalitarian idea that if somebody is successful and rich, they must have gotten it unjustly. And as I've stressed, that's the idea they seem to be unwilling to face and repudiate directly. Because, who wants to come out saying some kinds of inequality are not necessarily wrong? Not when the person who has the success has earned it through their own virtue, through their own productive achievement, and that therefore it is sometimes just to actually be selfishly rewarded for your achievement. They don't want to challenge that because the right doesn't want to acknowledge, conservatives, the Wall Street Journal editors don't want to acknowledge that idea behind egalitarianism is totally consistent with the idea of altruistic self-sacrifice that's been preached by Christian religion for decades. And so I found it rather ironic when Barton Swaim, one of the Wall Street editors, Wall Street Journal editors, in his version of this point about why it's the woke to blame, says, self-hating multiculturalism, a threat since the early 1970s, took over K through 12 and college curricula after the Cold War ended. And then for 2 generations, America's young people were taught to think of their country as a hellscape of predatory capitalism and of their world as a cold and godless moral vacuum. And he elsewhere in that essay says, yes, the problem is with irreligion. That's why people are socialists, because of atheism. Nothing could be further from the truth, because the ideas that empower multiculturalism, egalitarianism, etc., are the very quote-unquote godly ideas that Christian morality preaches, which young people listen to, which young people want to try to practice. And what Swaim and his ilk are unwilling to admit is that these so-called godly ideas are actually destructive of the good. They're destructive of happiness. They're destructive of morality, because ultimately when you preach self-sacrifice, when you preach the idea that those who are successful, those who have ability, should be torn down for the sake of those who don't, what you're really preaching is a kind of self-destruction for its own sake, not for the sake of anything else. But that's what Christianity has preached for such a long time. And I think it's a good opportunity here to close with, we'll still say one more thing, but before we get to the last point, it's good to share this passage from Ayn Rand, where she comments on the close connection between altruistic morality, which comes from religion, and socialism. And this is from her essay, her speech, Faith and Force Destroys the Modern World, which she gave in 1960. And she said, so long as altruism was their moral ideal, men had to regard capitalism as immoral. Capitalism certainly does not and cannot work on the principle of selfless service and sacrifice. From the start, while capitalism was creating the splendor of its achievements, creating it in silence, unacknowledged and undefended, morally undefended, the intellectuals were moving in greater and greater numbers toward a new dream, socialism. The socialists had a certain kind of logic on their side. If the collective sacrifice of all to all is the moral ideal, then they wanted to establish this ideal in practice, here and on this earth. The arguments that socialism would not and could not work did not stop them. Neither has altruism ever worked. But this has not caused men to stop and question it. Only reason can ask such questions. And reason, they were told on all sides, has nothing to do with morality. Morality lies outside the realm of reason. No rational morality can ever be defined. And of course, the reason that she's saying that reason, we're told on all sides that we shouldn't be rational about this, is because the idea that morality consists in self-sacrifice is itself one of these articles of faith that comes from religion, and she's making that connection here.
And at the end of the day, then, Ben, where does all this lead us? For me, it shows that these people don't understand what is socialism's strongest weapon, what is socialism's nuclear weapon. And this is socialism's moral appeal. A moral appeal that even its enemies cannot refute. And what happens is the enemies of socialism, let's say the conservatives, try to fight socialism by pointing out that theirs is a better system in bringing the very altruistic, so to speak, goals that socialism preaches. So they say, no, capitalism is better in helping the poor, so please give us a chance. But then if you agree, if you accept that your goal in life is to help the poor, that your duty, your main duty in life is to help the poor, not because you're benevolent, but this is what you have to do. And if then there are indeed still people out there who are poor or who live worse than some others, then under these premises, it's okay for someone like Mamdani to come and to coerce you with various policy measures in order for you to do your duty to these underprivileged. And this is what Mamdani promises to do. He promises to deliver on the moral code and on the moral messages that the conservatives have accepted, and apparently they're failing to deliver. And if they've failed to read the situation properly, obviously they're also failing, conservatives and centrists and liberals, they are failing in an alternative. And what would the alternative be? It would have to make a positive case for something different. It would be positive. It would be posing a positive alternative. All I see these other guys doing is saying, oh, we're not Mamdani, we're not socialists. Okay, then what are you? Where is the positive vision? Where is the alternative idealism that you have? So Mamdani is a young idealistic. Where is your idealism? Do you have any? Do you have this energy? Do you have this strong belief in your ideals? What are your ideals? Or are you just one of these pragmatists who say, well, let's don't go to extremes. Maybe a bit of this policy. Socialists have a point, liberals have a point, conservatives have a point. Let's meet in the middle. Is anyone going to be inspired by this? Where is the actually inspiring positive political alternative? We're not socialists, but what are we? Where is the positive alternative of the opposite of socialism, which is capitalism? So, Ben, no one is making a moral and enthusiastic and idealistic and inspiring case for capitalism, and this is why guys like Mamdani show up, and this is why I think at the end of the day he will win.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if he'll win this election, but I think he'll at the very least, people like Mamdani will continue to pop up, sometimes winning elections, sometimes not, unless they are deprived of the weapon of being able to use with uncontested sanction the moral ideals of Western civilization for the last 2,000 years. So yeah, what if the editors of the Wall Street Journal want to pose this trend? Yes, they need to offer an actual positive alternative to Mamdani. They need to take that weapon away from him. And that means, for one thing, actually educating people, including young people, about the nature of capitalism, about what it actually is, why it's different in principle from socialism, that various forms of mixed economy and statist intervention are not actually capitalism. They're totally inconsistent with it. We'll have more to say about that on future episodes. But especially it means trying to defend capitalism on moral grounds, understanding that the system of capitalism, which is a system of economic freedom in which people can profit if they earn their values on an open and free market, that kind of system is the moral defense of it is not the faith-based morality of self-sacrifice, which is totally incompatible with it. So there's no religious defense that you can give of this system. And that means that you need a moral alternative. You need a rational moral ideal that is concerned with what are the requirements of actually achieving positive values on Earth, that gives guidance for the real life questions that we face day to day in the course of our careers, in the course of having relationships with people, which a kind of guidance that the morality of altruism has never been able to give. And it is, of course, ultimately going to be an ideal of rational self-interest of the kind that Ayn Rand herself advocated. And I think that when you think about all of these considerations and you consider the kind of alternative that's really needed if you want to oppose socialism, and then wonder, well, why is socialism winning? Why does it keep returning? The answer is that it is not some kind of malevolent force or impulse, some kind of virus or plague that's with us for all time, that resurrects itself like a zombie. No, as I stressed from the beginning, socialism is a human choice, a choice we don't have to make, but it is a choice that is easier to make when the ones who choose it are empowered by their ability to draw on the moral and intellectual tradition of the West, and when even their opponents, such as the editors of the Wall Street Journal, share those ideals, promote those ideals of self-sacrifice that get from religion, don't bother to contest them, and as a result end up providing what Ayn Rand called the sanction of the victim. The idea that those who are victimized by socialism, in this case, the capitalists and their erstwhile advocates, end up giving energy and support to the very people who are victimizing them. In this case, the socialists, people like Mamdani. And if the editors of the Wall Street Journal want to stop it, they need to stop giving that ammunition, that energy, that sanction to their enemies, the socialists.
Well, as our colleague Sam said when we're discussing this episode, why is socialism winning? It's because of you guys, because of people who think they're fighting socialism, but actually giving it more ammunition. Ben, you have found some further reading resources. So for closing, where can people go to find more actual good ammunition against Mamdani and the ideas of Mamdani?
Sure. So first of all, you mentioned people should read Atlas Shrugged if they want to know more about Ayn Rand's case, not just against socialism, but against collectivism and altruism and all the forms of irrationality that go into this movement. This is the first place to look. If they want a brief primer, I'll suggest they take a look at the entry in the Ayn Rand lexicon on socialism. Many of these are quotes taken from Faith and Force Destroys the Modern World, also from her essay, The Monument Builders. You can look at her essay, Faith and Force Destroys the Modern World, in its entirety. I quoted from it above, but you can look at it in its entirety online, along with listening to a recording of the lecture version of it. I also have a couple of articles that touch on issues that came up in our conversation today. One is The Dishonesty of Real Socialism Has Never Been Tried, which we published in New Ideal back in August of 2020. This deals with that rationalization that we talked about that the socialists use to explain away the experience that otherwise would seem to be counter evidence to the success of socialism. But then I think more pertinently, The Old Morality of the New Religions, which I published in January 2023. And that talks about why it is the old Judeo-Christian ethic of self-sacrifice that is responsible for the ongoing currency of the so-called woke, that is of contemporary egalitarian movements, especially drawing on evidence presented here by John McWhorter in his book on so-called woke racism. So yeah, there's a number of things that I hope people will take a look at.
And on that happy note, many thanks for your time, people. Goodbye.